from the ACE Community Survey team.
Yes, me and Bauer are the two co-leads of the ACE Community Survey team. And I'm going to say that I mostly prepared this talk because Bauer was busy organizing the conference. So it will be mostly me talking, but you're free to jump in whenever you want. So a brief introduction. I'm Tristan. I'm also known as Sadie and known for running the group blog, the Asexual Agenda, and some other blogging stuff. But I also do this. I run along with Bauer, the ACE Community Survey team.
Yes,
okay, so here's like a brief overview of the ACE Community Survey team and its history and what we do. We were founded in 2014 by somebody on the AVEN project team. We are now independent. We're not affiliated with AVEN. And we're a volunteer project. We don't pay anybody. We just have like a bunch of helpful volunteers, only a few of which are active, so about like 10 at any time. And how many people have taken our survey before? That's almost everybody. Okay, so you know the deal that we have, like, we do it online, we recruit online mostly, and we have about 100 questions, and we get about 10,000 responses a year, mostly through Tumblr. This is our website. You can take a snapshot of that if you want, and you can find all our reports and analyses. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to like educate the ACE community about itself. But we also, we're here to provide data to researchers who request it from us, and in a few cases we actually collaborate with researchers. So next slide. Okay, so the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to have an interactive activity. We're going to do a survey and to talk about surveys. So, and this is a survey that I put online a couple weeks ago. And I know this URL is hard to follow, but you can snap a picture of it, and maybe we'll have it online. Yeah, yeah. So let's just jump in. Next. Okay, so the question is, are you a cat person or a dog person? And so let's just raise our hands. If you're a cat person, raise your hand. Okay, and now if you're a dog person, raise your hand. Okay, so most people here seem to be cat people, which is not surprising since online we found that most people are cat people, but then this is only representative of my readership. And of course, it's not just the numbers that matter, it's also your interpretation. So, so here's one interpretation. 75% are cat people and 25% are wrong. So I don't know, I didn't really catch anybody. Did anybody like raise their hands for both options or for neither? Yeah, so you're not supposed to do that. If you read the instructions carefully, it says like one.
I'm a rebel.
And it has to be exactly one because there's a star here. That means it's required. So if you did that, I'm sorry, you can't submit the survey. So the question is, like, how can we ask this so that maybe people can answer both or neither? So next slide. So here's the next question. Are you a cat person or a dog person? Okay, and here you can select any number of responses. Okay, so how many people are cat people? Okay, and how many people are dog people? Okay, there are a lot more now. And how many people are neither? Okay, so does anybody know why I added this neither option?
It's still a problem. Someone could choose neither and one of the others or both.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So actually, personally, when I answer this, I'm a dog person and also neither. Because I grew up with dogs, but I don't have any pets now. So it makes sense to me.
I thought it was to be inclusive of people who deal with either an impairment from an allergy or impairment from a psychiatric issue like a phobia of some sort?
Yeah, it could be dealing with that. It might be different for each person. You don't really get that information because all we have is like 3 yes/no of responses. The reason we include this is actually technical. It's because if you don't check either of the boxes, then it's going to look like you skipped the question. And this is a required question, so you're not allowed to skip. So that's why we need to add another option, even though that allows people to give these conflicting responses, which are not exactly conflicting. So online, when I did this, you actually see there's a pretty significant overlap between neither and cat and dog people, and I'm in the smallest group, sad. So I guess another issue is, so we have like, so now we have like all these extra groups, and so there's like some extra nuance. So how do we ask about that in another way? So go to the next slide. Okay, so here's like another way we can ask it is instead of having checkboxes, we just say cat, dog, boat, and that's it. But you see, I also added a few others. Unsure, and it fluctuates. And some people actually did check those responses. And really, even this is not enough. There's going to be more people with different answers. Yeah. For instance, maybe somebody is just like, eh.
I'm a lizard person.
Yeah. Yeah. So if we want to like let people choose even more options, we're going to ask it another way. So next slide. Okay, and this is called a free response question. You can just type in whatever you want. And this is called a multiple choice with a write-in. So if they select this option, then they can type in whatever they want. So this is the next one we're going to do. Okay, go back. We're not showing that yet. Okay, so we're going to do this free response question. So I want everybody in your mind to think, what are you going to write into this question? Just think in your mind, don't say it out loud yet. And I'm going to count to 3, and you can all say out loud what your answer is. Okay, ready? Okay, 1, 2, 3.
I'm a bird person.
Okay, that was some great data.
Fish person?
Were we recording that? Yeah? Okay, good. Then we got it all. We can analyze it later. Okay, so what does the data for this look like? So in this multiple choice with write-in, we have we have a lot of people that just choose one of the first 2 options, but then we have all these people who choose other, and this is what it ends up looking like. You have like some very useful data here. And actually the most common thing to write in was both. But if you notice if you compare this to our last chart, there's actually a lot more both here and a lot less here. So we kind of changed the result by asking it a different way. Yeah, and in practice, like we often have to put all these people into an other category. So it like gives people the freedom to say whatever they want, but in the end, like they have freedom to be in the other category. It's not so useful. Now for this free response question, it's actually very hard to work with that. One thing you can do is make a word cloud. Next slide. So that's what I did. Most people are persons.
Meow.
Yeah, I like this one. And this is based on like 300 responses, so many of these are like just one person wrote this.
Popsicle.
So yeah, it's pretty hard to use this data. You can make a pretty picture, but okay. So what's another way we can ask this question? Next slide. So are you a cat person or a dog person? So there's a spectrum. 1 is cat person, 5 is dog person. Okay, so we're gonna raise our hands for this. So how many people are a 1? Okay. And how many people are a 2? Great. And how many people are a 3? Okay. How many people are a 4? And a 5? Did we like get more dog people? Last 10 minutes. Felt like it. Okay. So this is called a liker question, and this is our results from online. This allows people like more freedom in terms of how to answer, and it gives us actually usable data. Of course, it comes with its own set of assumptions. So, like, if you're a cat person, does that mean you're not into dogs? Also, you know. So my reaction to this kind of thing is like, oh wow, spectrum, so include. Yeah. Okay, but seriously, like a better way to ask this question is maybe like separate these two axes, and then you have two likers. So I'm a cat person, I'm a dog person. I'm not gonna ask this one out loud. So there are too many options. There are like, well, in total there are gonna be 25 groups here. And when I analyzed this, I made a color chart. and so there are 25 boxes here, and the color of the box indicates how many people were in that box. And I like to think of this as the cat and dog storms model. Yeah, so there are many different ways to ask this question. Next slide. So again, I'm just flashing this URL. There are like 12 questions on this, there's more. And so there are many different ways to ask the same question. You get different results depending on how you ask it. And so the question is, what are our priorities? What are we valuing here? What is the survey for? And so next slide. This may seem a little strange, but for some people who take our survey, what the survey is for to them is like being represented. You know, people like to be seen in their favorite TV shows, their favorite comic books, their favorite books. So why not also be seen in their favorite annual community survey? Next slide. And so, like, you know, that's what a lot of people like about it. It's just like having an option just for you. But we're not against this, but it's not really our goal. Because like if you ask a question like a free response question, that helps. Well, a lot of people love that kind of question. They love being to type in whatever they want because it allows them to be seen. But in terms of like what data gives us, it doesn't really give us useful data a lot of the time. So it's sort of like the benefit is very short term, and there's no long term benefit if we can't use that data for anything. So our goal is next slide. So it might be a little closer to this, crunching people into data. And that seems a little inhumane, but I mean, that is effectively what we're doing. We're making these graphs using people. And the idea is to, like, you know, actually make something useful out of all these graphs. So we're, next slide, we're using these graphs and we're producing understanding and education. So like what we're looking towards is not like the experience of taking the survey, but the experience of reading the reports afterwards and learning more about the community. Okay, so now we're finally gonna get to the part of the talk where we actually talk about data. The emphasis I want to make is like how this data can be used to like produce insights for activists. And so this is one of the most important graphs in our results is just gender. Like what are the gender ratios? And you see that, you know, it's mostly women, mostly cis women. There's about 25% non-binary people, not all of whom identify as trans. And the number of men is very small. So what does this mean for activism? Well, for one thing, if you're not including like non-binary people, that's like a really large chunk of the community you're leaving out. So that's one obvious conclusion. I also worry a lot about this small percentage because I don't know what it means. Like, are men being excluded from the community? Is there some reason that they're less likely to identify as asexual spectrum in the first place? And there's a potential like for a lot of pain there that we don't really understand because they're not here.
Actually, I do understand. I was socialized male, and I think the reason why men have trouble is because of the masculine urges related to testosterone and what that means and what we want. I know that for me, getting involved in A spaces, that definitely complicated matters. At the time, I was still presenting as male, even though I'm transgender. So I think that, and also the way sexuality is talked about among men, it's in a culture anybody who feels different than that is like frowned upon.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. Huh?
You
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
should I go to the next slide?
Yeah, and the next one is about race. And I don't know if Bauer wants to take the overview.
Sure. So race and ethnicity is something that we did originally in 3 different ways. We did it with the surveys, with the censuses of the US, the UK, and Australia. Is it Australia?
US, UK, and Canada.
US, UK, and Canada. Thanks, Canada. But a question that we had been getting was we don't have a way to look at everybody who took the survey, and we don't have a way to look at everybody who took the survey overall, because they're separated into 3 different questions, which makes it more complicated to be able to put them all together. So this is specifically the US
Yeah.
data, which is, okay, and so in more recent iterations, we've added in an overall race question. And so some things to look at are, first of all, are we not reaching as many people of color, because 78% of people who are taking the survey are white. Something else to look at is the total population of the US, which is somewhat similar to that. So in terms of laying that over to the population, it makes a little bit more sense, but also indicates that we would benefit greatly from more participation from people of color. Is there something we're doing that inhibits that? Is there places where we could encourage people to participate? Or is there something else we're doing that we could improve? Things like that. And then, yes.
The way in white communities it's talked about, there's this issue and this assumption when people make these things on all issues, make surveys, they don't take into account the cultural disconnect of the white working class. And as someone who comes from that, it's a very interesting thing to me that, like, all of a sudden, just because, I graduated from high school and became an activist and stuff, now people are assuming privileges and things that I don't actually have. And I find that to be a very interesting thing, because in white working class communities, these issues aren't talked about at all. They're really not. They're extremely conservative. They don't have any interest in it. They don't have the luxury to do this type of introspection, because they're living either close to, or even if they are educated, they're working getting jobs.
Yeah. I think that it's really important to focus on a variety of the different issues, including issues for the white working class, but it's also very important to highlight any issues for people of color specifically and let that stand sort of on its own. And then in addition, we can look at also concerns for the white working class. I might also ask for the more slides to get through. Would you like to do the next
Yeah.
one?
I'm just going to mention we have
Sure.
data, lots more data on this. I just picked out the US race stuff because that's like the simplest thing to focus on. When it comes to talking about race internationally, it's like really, really complicated. So next slide. So next is, this is the favorable, indifferent, repulsed trichotomy, which many people are familiar with. Internally, we call it sexual disposition. And we actually have extra options, so we have an other write-in, and we also have an uncertain option. So the reason I'm showing this is because I remember back in 2014, it was a thing for people to think that most ACEs were sex favorable, and there were very few sex repulsed people, which is kind of strange, but it was a respectability politics thing, where people felt that in order to market themselves to like the LGBT community or to market asexuality as queer, they felt they needed to emphasize this aspect and de-emphasize this aspect. And so people who were sex repulsed were not talking about it too much. And this was creating false impressions within the community. And so, like, one of the important things when we first did our survey was just showing, actually, this is the largest group. And it's important to remember that. And more recently, we've looked at this question, and one issue with this, these are basically undefined terms. Like, different people have different definitions for them. So we were looking into, like, what definitions are people using by studying empirically. And we broke it into two axes. One which is how comfortable people are with sex in the media, and whether people feel positively or negatively about possibly engaging in sex. So next slide. So here I have another one of those color charts, and I have it broken down by group. And basically what you can see here is that a lot of people fit along the diagonal across all groups. So that means that there's some correlation between how they feel about sex in media and how they feel about engaging in sex. But there's also like people who are off the diagonal, like these squares here. So another thing we can say is that it seems like the people are often choosing their labels based on this vertical axis, so how they feel about engaging with sex. So in a way, that's like the more predominant definition. I honestly don't know what's going on here. I was surprised when I saw this. It seems that not many people in this uncertain or other group are neutral about engaging in sex. This is true for both groups individually too. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is another really important issue that both Bauer and I have been working on. This is the work of a collaboration we have actually with a research group in Northwestern University, part of the Institute for Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Well-Being, and we have a paper that, like, I think it's going to be submitted soon. And this is like one small sample of the results. So when we first looked at depression and suicide, it was like really difficult for us because there's so many additional factors. It's very strongly impacted by race and age. And so they did some work to disentangle those factors.
Yeah. One of the biggest finding in overlaying race is that Native women have the worst outcomes for pretty much everything across the board, which is terrible. And so this paper is really important because it's being taken by researchers to push it forward in other ways, which can also help lead to policy changes and can help advocate for asexuality to be included in a variety of future studies, which can then help. Because we have our survey, which is only looking at the ACE community, and we're only getting data from the ACE community. But when it's included with surveys that are doing other things, that means that it's more representative of people in general who are asexual, because it's not only people who are very involved and know what's going on. Does that make any sense? Okay.
Yeah, so this data is based on our survey, and for comparison, so you see 42% are diagnosed with depression. And they found another study that said, that was looking at the general US population, and for people under 30, this percentage was 20%. And then there was another study that looked at people dividing by sexual orientation. So it was 13% among heterosexual men, 22% among heterosexual women, 32% among gay men, 35% among lesbian women, and 23% among bisexual men, 49% among bisexual women. So like, to summarize all that, I'm sure you didn't catch all that. Like this is high relative to the general population. There are some groups that have it higher, but like,
Yeah.
we're not.
Gender
necessarily-
has a big overlap,
Yeah.
particularly in the trans and non-binary communities. But the asexual population as a whole has much higher overlap with the LGBTQ community as a whole, and in general, it seems like some of the outside pressures of the world being in a situation where you don't necessarily fit into how society is created may have a really big effect on people's mental health.
Yeah, and yeah, these additional percentages are like intersections for various groups. And you can see it differs across groups, but it's all very high. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the last thing we want to talk about are the possibility of like studying the Aro population, because I know many organizations are now like trying to shift to cover both ACE and Aro people. So we've been talking about this, and this is all like new stuff. We've still been making decisions. So if people have feedback about this, we'd love to hear it. So next slide. So first, I'm going to talk about some background. I wanted these to be like fuzzy boundaries, but the version of the Mac version of PowerPoint won't. So what we have here is we have people on the ACE spectrum and people on the Aro spectrum, and there's some overlap, but there's also people who are not overlapping. So you have the ACE allo-romantic people, and you have the allosexual Aro people. Okay, and so the question is like, what do we want to study in our survey? Our survey is mostly recruiting people from the ACE spectrum. It's called the ACE Community Survey. So should we also recruit from this, from the Aro spectrum, or should we have two separate surveys? But it actually gets even more complicated than this. So what we actually have is we have two communities which are, not everybody is involved in the respective communities. So you might have Aro ACE people who are only in the ACE community, or Aro ACE people who are only in the Aro community. So the question is like, if we're interested in studying the Aro spectrum, so we put out another survey, what exactly are we interested in studying? Are we gonna get all the Aro spectrum people we could find? Because if we do that, then most of the people we're gonna end up recruiting are people in the ACE community, and not necessarily here. So another possibility is if we somehow limit recruiting to just the Aro community, but that's very hard. How do you limit recruiting? Like, it's hard to answer the question even, like, is somebody part of the Aro community or not? That's not really a binary. Then there's even more complicated factors. So next slide. So Aro communities have their own surveys. So maybe another possibility is instead of making our own survey, we take a supporting role in like helping them make their own surveys. So this is just like one website with a few surveys. I actually wrote a review article linking to a bunch of surveys that they themselves have done and reported on, and summarizing some of the results. These are all like one-person projects basically, and based on talking to like people who have run these surveys, my impression is they don't just want us to help them; they want the help to go in both directions. Which makes sense. And also, like, these surveys are in fact helpful to us because they're surveying mostly the Aro community. That's where the recruitment is centered. Although there's a question, like, are they actually getting some people who are in the ACE community but not the Aro community. We don't really know. So they do like provide this data which is new to us and useful to us. So I'm gonna, for the next section, I'm gonna talk about just analyzing our own survey, looking at the Aro Spectrum people and see what we can find. So next slide. Still on, yeah. Okay, so first of all, here are the percentages of people in our survey. There's going to be an upcoming blog post on our blog about this, and I'll have like all this information more. But here's a first result is we find that among like ACE Spectrum people in our survey, it's about half and half alloromantic, half Aro Spectrum. And we have a very small number of allosexual Aros responding to our survey. And then you also have people who are neither, because we're open to everybody. Okay, and next we want to look at how these groups differ. So first thing is gender, right? So I say neither here, that's because the way the question is phrased. What gender are you? Man, woman, or neither of the above? And then there's another question asking for further details. So what stands out to me is that the number of non-binary people here is 20%, and it's 30% here and here. So there's actually some intersection between gender and aromantic spectrum, where Aro spec people are more often non-binary. Another thing I noticed here is there seem to be more men among the allosexual Aros, although this is a very small group, so it's hard to know whether that would be constant. So for reference, I looked at the Aro community surveys. So one of the surveys asked about gender, and this is what they found. This is huge. Like, there are more non-binary people than there are men and women combined. So that's very interesting. And you also see that this is qualitatively different from what we got here. So now let's look at the next thing. Okay, so here we're looking at the Aro spectrum. So there are many different parts. You have like people who are aromantic, but also demi-romantic, gray romantic, both romantic, queer romantic, Aro flux, questioning, and there might be some others. You see in our survey, I think this is 60% aromantic, and you have a rather large number of these other groups. But if you compare to the Aro community surveys, there's a lot of, like this is 70% aromantic, and the number of these other ones is relatively small. So why is that? Well, we don't really know. One possibility is that, the people who gravitate most to the Aro community might be people who are like aromantic rather than on the aromantic spectrum more broadly. Another thing you notice is that these numbers for the allosexual Aros are pretty similar to this. Personally, I think that's because we mostly get these people through recruiting through the Aro communities. So that's the thing. Next, the last thing we're going to look at is just like how many people are single. So we ask relationship questions, and you see like Aro aces are most likely to be single, 80%, which matches what you have in Aro community surveys. So that's about it. If you have any questions about this, feel free to ask. There's also going to be a publication about this. Yeah.
The question that I have is, it seems like to me you're overly assuming competence, and like, what about people who have an IQ below 70? Like some people who are intellectually disabled, they are like erased from these conversations and being thought of as emotionless, and no feelings of gender or sexuality or anything. I fight it all the time. But I also know most people can't, because most people are not as functioning as I am. And it seems like to me, if you're not dealing with that particular population, then what are you getting from assuming that everyone's just as confident as next? also, what is this going to do for somebody who's trying to come out of vet centers? You know, there was this great movie, Beach Rats, about this gay guy who came out. He spent a lot of time in Brighton Beach, and he really tried, you know, and it was really difficult. I went to school down there, and it seems to me like a lot of this, while it is nice to think about, in reality, what is the practical implications for people who fall outside of this?
Yeah, we can't do everything. And if you have specific ideas of how we might be able to be more inclusive, I could talk to you about this separately afterwards. Would
So-
you be interested in that?
Yeah.
I also have an answer, which is it's important to remember that what we're surveying in this survey is mostly people who are in the ACE community, who are active in the ACE community, and that's going to leave out some people for various reasons. So, like, for instance, somebody once told me, like, they thought the reason there aren't too many trans women in our survey is because trans women are that's a big deal, and they're going to be mostly focusing on their own communities that directly address their needs. So, like, they're not here, and we see that they're missing, and so by their absence, we can say something about the community, but we're not, like, saying something about asexual people or asexual spectrum people in general.
Okay, let's get a stack of questions going. So maybe Jasmine in front, and then you can go. Does somebody else have a question? Okay, so we'll start with
Yeah, so I think mine is not so much a question as kind of a point of excitement, because I'm a qualitative researcher, and there were several comments you made that are sort of highlighting to me the spaces where you have done what you can with quantitative research, and you now need to be engaging with or sort of thinking about new ways to get qualitative research. And I think that that is something that the community as a whole is like well positioned to contribute to, especially people who are very engaged are also very often the ones willing to talk. So I'm like super excited, because I also know as a public health person, like they don't care until we have numbers, and the numbers are essential, including like from surveys about depression. We can't do anything without that data. So I love qualitative data, but we need both. So I'm so excited to have this.
Yeah. So
Even
our
though you're
survey.
volunteering, you shouldn't pay for it.
And if you know anybody who wants to do it, we'll give you data to do it.
Yeah, our survey is largely a quantitative project, but you definitely need that other half of like qualitative stories, you know, explaining like, you know, we like show the numbers here, but numbers don't really grab people, and you know, we can like point to these numbers about depression and suicide all we want, but people still aren't talking about it. You need stories, right?
I have a question about the slide.
Yes.
Which is this single as opposed to partnered, or single as opposed to married, divorced, widow?
I believe it's single as opposed to being in a romantic relationship.
Do you have the figure for married?
I think in the new version
Yes,
of the
we do.
question that we created, we split it out into married, into married, and then also we combined the question about the number of partners you have versus, yes. And
Is there any distinction for non-romantic partnerships?
yes, we have other questions. I don't think they're on the slide deck, but we also ask specific questions about whether or not partners are romantic, and then also say, do you have any non-romantic partners?
Yeah, so I don't want to get it out right now because it would take me a while, but I believe that the number of married people in each of these groups is on the order of under 5%.
Not five.
Yeah, technically I'm Aro and ACE, and I'm also married, so I'm like in one of those like tiny groups.
Can we get hands, particularly for anybody who hasn't had a chance to ask a question so far? Okay, yes. So I'm gonna ask.
I have a follow-up.
I'm gonna get a stack of questions. So you're gonna go first, then you're gonna go second, then you're gonna go third, and then you're gonna go fourth. Okay.
It was the quickest follow-up. The non-romantic partners, are they part of the single or not the single? In that
They're separate questions, so people get to choose for themselves. So people would answer one question, and then they would be able to answer the other question in their own choice.
different gender results from your survey versus comparing to some Aro surveys. And I wanted to ask, do you know how much of a difference there was in terms of like what sites those were posted on, or like where they were circulated? Because I had a hunch, but I was wondering.
Well, those would largely be circulating on Tumblr, but then so is our survey. So I do wonder about that. Maybe one factor is that aromantic people are more likely to be non-binary as opposed to the rest of the spectrum, which might be less likely. But I don't really know. I haven't analyzed that hypothesis.
Yeah, my question are pretty similar. And this really reveals my ignorance about the Aro community that's not in any way connected with the ACE community. Where would be some of the primary places that people would be accessing that survey / that community?
So the Aro community is primarily located on Tumblr, the Arocalypse forums, and Discord.
Yeah, Discord being the chat. Come on.
So, in your research of the aromantic community surveys, did any of them, well, first of all, how many did you review? And then was there any questions regarding sexual orientation within those? And what were the
So
numbers for that?
there were 9, and no, which is very frustrating to me. Actually, I don't know how many of these people are asexual spectrum in their surveys. There was one person who added a question and then removed it mid-survey, and they just say in the report, the vast majority were asexual spectrum, and I don't know what that means. But there's also an issue, like, even if they did get the numbers, it's hard to know, like, what that actually says, because as I said, they could be recruiting a lot from the ACE community, because they're in the same places they're in Tumblr. You know, if you post a survey and then, like, somebody in the ACE community gets a hold of it and posts it, then you might get a lot of, like, Aro ACE people who are not part of the Aro community, but are part of the ACE community. And that's, like, a much larger community, so they might even, like, dominate the results. So that's, like, a really hard question to answer.
Well, if I may ask, so what does the future of that collaboration, that potential collaboration look like?
I would love it if somebody helped start an Aro community survey that did something annually. We've been asked to be inclusive of the Aro community, and we have questions and we have data, and people can overlap that, and things like adding an additional question or two so that they can use the data that we get elsewhere in the survey, we are completely fine with. And that doesn't add hundreds of extra hours of work for us. For example, the last report we did, I personally put in at least 100 or 200 hours of work in only the month of October. So, like, we are not at the capacity to be able to do an aromantic survey, which is what it really deserves, is to have its own survey. So if you know anybody, we have code that you can use, and we are willing to share, and we're willing to do whatever. But we have, as Siggy was saying, like 10 active people at any given time. We have like monthly meetings with at least 5 people each time, and a lot of people doing a lot of work throughout. Yes, you.
Okay. All right. Wow. Asking. Okay. So can you tell us some about the behind the scenes for generating your cool graphs? Like how to what do you use for that?
I use pandas a lot, primarily. A lot of it is creating the tables initially and then having the tables be formatted exactly how you want them to be, and they can be turned into graphs. For some reason, Python does not automatically add like percentages to the end of bars, so I have a lot of handwritten code to do that with like spacing and text sizing and all this. Talk to me later is the answer to that. But we write the reports in Python. For some reason, Python does not have the ability to print a pretty table, so that is turned into HTML, which then is formatted in CSS, and then is turned into a PNG, and then is Yeah, so you can hit me up about that later if you were interested. Yes.
This is going to be obviously a case-by-case basis, but in your whole time working on this, what was the most shocking data or unexpected data that you found, or like correlation or anything like that?
Suicide was so bad that I had to take a break. Personally, I was working on a blog, and then I just got kind of burnt out about looking at that.
Yeah. Understandable.
Yeah. Dudes that you.
I don't know if I have an answer to that.
No. Yeah, but sometimes when you see things that don't make any, like in your head, you think they don't make any sense together, like people who are neither cat nor dog people, but also say that they're a dog person.
Right.
There are some overlaps with different questions for that. I don't know if I have enough.
Just curious.
Also, that half of the community is Aro, or on the Aro Spectrum. And that's a really good example of being asked to include more Aro things and pointing out that our report doesn't necessarily highlight information about the Aro community, which is data that we do have. So that is an example of data we do have that's been pointed out, and so now in our next survey we can have a whole section or page on this is the data we do have on the Aro community, and first of all, they're about half of the ACE community that we get data on. If anybody wants to go to the Dyke March, you should leave now. No? Okay. Are there more questions? Is there anybody who hasn't asked a question yet? All right, let's go from the back. So, 1, 2, 3, 4.
How much work have you done with looking at changes and trends over time? And are there any especially notable trends you've noticed since you started doing the survey?
So that's something that we want to analyze, but we haven't gotten around to doing. There are some questions that we ask year after year, partly so we can track the changes, but we haven't done that analysis. We're short on labor all the time.
Yeah, the next survey report is going to be 2017 and 2018, and I'm telling myself it's going to be out by Sexual Awareness Week.
October.
In October, so I still have a lot of time. But in that report, you'll have immediately 2017 and 2018 to compare. But we're getting to the point where we'll have 5 different years of data for some questions. So I know that there's intentionally been a question about where did you come into the community, or where do you most frequently watch or comment or post, or are you online or offline? I think we have one blog post of over time things?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not that we're aware of. Okay, something we're working on. And then, Elliot?
Yes, I noticed that none of your graphs have any confidence intervals. Is that because you chose not to present them, or is there some statistical reason why they cannot be generated from this sort of?
Well, first of all, for the graphs here, most of them I generated just for this talk and did it fairly quickly. I think in general we don't really report them because it just takes a lot of extra work. And so I think in the top section of our report we give people the mathematical formula for people to calculate this themselves. And for some important things we calculate what is the p-value of this result.
Yeah, we started adding in chi-square distribution tests to see if it's statistically significant, and have started adding in whether or not it is, because I have code that will automatically determine that. So if I got code or I wrote code that automatically determined confidence intervals, that is something that we could add. Do you have another question?
Yes, also, in response to the previous one, I think you mentioned in a blog post at some point, something about changes among the asexual spectrum of which particular label people were using, but I can't remember which direction it was. Do you remember that?
I don't remember writing about this.
Something about there being either more
recent?
gray asexual people or less gray asexual people at the time, but I forget.
Yeah, I don't remember writing a blog post about that. We did for a little while want to do some analysis tracking the number of gray A and demisexual people over time, because it appears to be declining over time. It's very interesting. However, we have a confounding factor, and that is in 2016 we added an option to that question, which is questioning or uncertain So it's very hard to tell, like, is this group actually getting smaller, or is it just because we asked the question a different way? And I think that change was important enough that I don't regret adding it. It makes it a lot hard to do, like, answer questions about that.
Did you have a
Yeah. Do you guys get requests to like use your data from outside sources
Mhm.
and stuff?
Yeah, we get a lot of researchers, we get students in school, we get journalists. We say yes to the researchers, we don't always say yes to the journalists. If you're writing, if you are also ACE yourself, you are much more likely to have us give it to you.
We get a lot of requests, actually, and some of them eventually produce papers. And we have a list of people who have cited us on our website, about
Yeah.
10 papers. So.
Yes.
And then average survey, since you used the website reach so far, how many people are we talking about that participated?
So I said about 10,000 a year. It changes a bit from year to year, but it seems to be about constant.
This last year we had like 15,000, didn't we?
Yeah.
It was so big we had to do something special to download it from Google Forms. Or I couldn't open it in Google Forms. You had to only download it.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was, I said, oh no, it stopped working. People stopped taking it after this date. No, you're just missing 5,000 more responses because you have to download it. All right, that is time. Thank you so much for coming. You can find us, we're available, you can find us online.